the army that the Ukrainians do, and as so long as no one else launches an invasion
Right.
of Russia proper or sends regular troops into Ukraine, they will win this.
What about Putin's remark, I think on Sunday,
Решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
using nukes if anybody interferes?
Well, it doesn't make me feel great, but the Russians have done this off and on for 70 years. And so all the people in the West who nuclear policy is their responsibility, they all perked up. They all looked at it very, very closely, and they're like, okay, nothing's really changed. It's just rhetoric. All of I think that the term they use is muscle memory within the nuclear forces. Nothing has moved. This is just Putin being a bit of a prick.
Yeah.
It's not something you should ignore, but it's also not something you should overly worry about.
What do you think Putin wants on a personal basis? Is he just an evil tyrant? Is he looking to make a name for himself in a really bad way, or is he desperate because he knows his time is up? Right.
I think those are the top three categories here.
Okay.
He is an evil tyrant. He is a dictator, and now everybody but Tucker Carlson admits it. Even Tulsi Gabbard and Bernie Sanders have switched sides finally. Second, he is desperate for his country because he realized that demographically they're in collapse and they have very little time left. And yeah, he wants to be remembered as the next Peter the Great or Catherine the Great, somebody who remade the Russian condition and allowed the country to coast on those successes for decades to come. It's our job to make sure he fails at all three.
Are we going to be able to do that? And how?
The United States will not be intervening directly because Ukraine is not a NATO ally. Have you seen the reports of that massive 40-plus mile long convoy coming out of Belarus?
I was thinking that one of our drones could easily take care of that. But
well, it would take more than one. That's kind of a good example of how the Russians suck at logistics. Mm-hmm. So if it came to a direct head-to-head fight between the United States and the Russians, one, our military is brilliant at logistics. It's like it's Disneyland, the military, everybody else.
Right.
And the only thing they're better at is taking out a large number of vehicles that are in a line.
Yeah.
So if it did come to a regular war between Russia and the United States, we would wipe the floor with them in terms of the armored warfare and the artillery battle. And then they would feel that they would have no choice but to consider nukes. There's no reason to expect the United States to directly intervene.
Right.
We will play favorites. We are playing favorites. Congress is going to be asked tonight to send at least $6 billion in direct military equipment to the Ukrainians. I figure that'll pass in a matter of seconds. Mm-hmm. We have sent a whole lot of javelins. We don't know how many, probably at least 1,000 launchers by this point, and every country in NATO is sending everything they have. One of the fun things about NATO is that during the Cold War, there were different tiers of military equipment because some countries were more advanced. When the Cold War ended, everyone spent 15 years upgrading their equipment, and they handed the older stuff to the new allies in Central Europe and Turkey. Now, all of those countries have upgraded their equipment, and they're sending all their hand-me-downs to Ukraine. So there's a metric butt ton of stuff that's going into Ukraine right now. Mm-hmm. And that is not going to turn the tide of the war, but it means that the Russians will have to pay in blood for every single inch. And once they capture it, they'll be partisans and they'll have to go back and do it again. And the only way the Russians know how to deal with that is to level everything.
God, that's awful. You know, I've been to Ukraine twice, and that was already a struggling country with infrastructure problems galore. I guess the one slight positive we can look at is if they receive the funding to rebuild, and if Russia doesn't take over, or at least not completely, they'll be replacing things with new stuff. But it's just awful to think of.
And this is just the next phase in what the Russia sees as multi-step expansion. They're not done with Ukraine.
Yeah. Do you think we'll get any help from the Russians themselves? I mean, the anti-war protests that are going on in Russia.
Well, most of the soldiers are draftees. So you can imagine how they feel about what's going on right now, since they didn't realize that this is what they were going to be in for.
Right.
For the Russians back in Russia, no. There have been a number of protest movements in Russia over the last several years, and they've got progressively smaller. And when I looked yesterday at the numbers, there were only about 6,000 Russians total that have been arrested so far nationwide.
Yep.
That's nowhere near enough to generate the sort of activity that Putin's going to be even the least bit concerned about.
Right.
The report I heard this morning from Ukraine, which made me perk up a little bit is that apparently a couple platoons of Russian soldiers surrendered to the Ukrainians and not after a fight. If you
Wow.
get mass desertions among the Russian soldiers, then we're talking about a very different situation. But this is one report that has not been confirmed.
Talk about the economic side of this. I think at least initially we're going to see more easing from our Fed, maybe downward pressure on interest rates. I mean, we've already had that, that it's been just toxic the way it's gone through the pandemic.
I'm not going to comment on the Fed because the Fed is about to be thrown 1,000 curveballs, and I'm not sure the Fed has the tools to deal with this, even if we all agreed on what needed to be done. Let me put this from the Ukrainian and the Russian point of view.
Yeah, and agriculture, of course, because Ukraine is a big exporter and fertilizer.
Russia is the #1 exporter of wheat, and it just invaded the #5 exporter of wheat. Ukraine will not plant crops this spring. We have shortages in every kind of fertilizer, nitrogen, because natural gas prices are up by a factor of 7 before the Russian moves. They're going to go up more. Phosphate, because the Chinese have blocked exports because they're terrified about what's about to happen internally. And 40% of the world's potash comes from Belarus and Russia. No matter how this shakes out, we are going to have famine continental in scope before the end of the year. And this is just the beginning of the unwinding of global agriculture.
How many people are you talking about when you say
this year? I don't know,
scope?
but the carrying capacity of the land in a deglobalized world is about 1 billion, billion and a half less than what we have right now.
Right, which by the way is the subject of your new book coming out, right?
Yes, the whole point of the end of the world is just the beginning, is to look at what all the economic sectors look like on the backside of globalization once it's gone. So remove all the structures that have allowed us to build and grow to where we are. What happens when they're just not there anymore? And it's different for every sector, it's different for every region, but agriculture is by far the chapter that gives me the most nightmares.
What you're saying is this conflict right now, the result of it is going to be a continental-sized famine for Europe?
Europe's probably okay. Good farmland, good local fertilizer processing. They're going to have some definite problems, but not famine. Let me give you a point of reference. In 2010, there were a bunch of fires in Siberia because they had a really horrible season for ag, and so the Russians intervened in markets and prevented exports from their part of the world for a few months. Global wheat prices doubled. Global wheat prices tripled in some of the places that used to rely on Ukrainian, Kazakh, and Russian wheat. And that triggered a series of uprisings and coups and wars that we now know as the Arab Spring. And that was from a partial disruption, not a complete disruption. And that had nothing to do with fertilizer. Fertilizer just flowed fine. What we're dealing here is at least a factor of 6 bigger than that. If you look at the countries that have really expanded their agricultural footprint of late, Western Australia, Brazil, they do it all with imported inputs. They're just not there right now.